5 women, left to die in the snow, heard a growl in the dark. Was it their end, or their fight's beginning? The wind roared like a living thing, slashing at the women as they trudged through the endless white. It was a cold so brutal it sank into their bones, turning every breath into a sharp, burning ache. Their bodies hunched forward, shoulders curled against the storm's fury. Snow piled high, reaching their knees, sometimes higher, dragging at their legs like thick, icy hands. Each step was slow, heavy, a battle against the freeze. Every gasp stung their throats. Every movement sent pain rippling through their tired muscles. But they couldn't stop. Stopping meant giving up. Stopping meant death creeping closer, silent and sure. Hannah Carter led the way, her figure a faint shadow at the front of the group. Her legs trembled beneath her, weak from days, or was it weeks, of walking. She couldn't tell anymore. Once, she'd held her head high, her steps steady, her heart full of purpose. She'd been a woman who knew where she was going. Now, she staggered, her feet so numb she couldn't feel the ground beneath them. Her hands, curled into stiff, useless claws, hid inside gloves so torn they barely held together. The fabric was damp, crusted with ice. Her lips, cracked and raw, bled with every gust that hit her face. She pressed them tight, fighting the urge to cry out. She threw a quick glance over her shoulder, squinting through the swirling snow. The others were falling behind, too far behind. Megan Brooks knelt in the snow, once strong enough to lift grain sacks or chop wood effortlessly, now weak and crumpled. Her auburn hair hung in frozen clumps, icicles glinting faintly. Her pale face sank into the drifts, breaths shallow. "We have to keep moving," Hannah called hoarsely, stumbling toward her. Megan flinched as Hannah grabbed her arm, her wild eyes unfocused, lips moving silently. Hannah knelt, pressing her forehead to Megan's icy skin. "Don't let them win," she whispered fiercely. Megan's fingers twitched, recalling Jake, her cruel brother-in-law, who'd stripped her of land, home, and dignity, then cast her into the storm to die. Hannah tugged her up, steadying her as she wobbled. Nearby, Lily Evans swayed, arms clutched tight, her usual smirk replaced by fragile eyes. Once a witty saloon girl, she'd been discarded by her boss into the cold. "I can't feel my hands," she murmured, unheard. Grace Miller marched stiffly beside her, jaw clenched, her pain buried after her family took her son and left her to the storm. Claire Dawson brought up the rear, limping badly, one hand pressed hard against her ribs. She'd been kicked there, hard, before her family threw her out of their cabin. She'd fought back, clawing at them, screaming until her voice gave out. They'd beaten her for it, each blow a warning. "This is what happens when you defy us." Her father's voice still echoed in her head, cold and final, as they dragged her into the snow and left her there. She pressed harder against her side, her breath hitching with every step, but she didn't stop. These 5 women, Hannah, Megan, Lily, Grace, Claire, had found each other by chance, each discarded like trash by the people who were supposed to care. It was a cruel twist, a bitter joke from fate, binding them together in this frozen hell. They didn't know how far they'd come or how long they'd been walking. Days, weeks, time blurred into one long, aching stretch of cold. They hadn't felt the kiss of a fire in so long they could barely remember its warmth. All they knew, deep in their gut, was one truth: they were going to die out here. But Hannah wouldn't let that happen. She forced herself forward, each step a stab of agony she refused to feel. Her boots sank deep into the snow. Her legs screamed for rest, but she pushed on. "Keep moving," she said again, her throat so raw the words scratched like sandpaper. Her voice was a whisper now, nearly lost in the storm's roar. The wind answered with a vicious scream, shaking the ground beneath them, blurring the horizon until the world was nothing but a wall of white. Then, a sound cut through the chaos. A low, guttural growl, rolling from the darkened trees ahead. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the snow shifting. It was something alive, something hungry. Hannah's heart stopped for a beat, her breath catching in her chest. Another growl, closer this time, sharp and menacing. Her frozen fingers fumbled in the snow, closing around a stick half buried beneath the drifts. She gripped it tight, knowing it was useless, knowing it wouldn't save them. She squinted into the twilight. Then she saw them, eyes glowing yellow, bright and piercing through the haze. Wolves. One stepped forward, its paws silent on the snow. Then another, a third. More lingered in the shadows of the trees, their shapes faint but growing clearer. Their ribs jutted out, sharp under thin fur. Their fangs flashed long and deadly. They were starving, desperate, and these women were their prey. Lily gasped, stumbling back, her breath bursting out in a white mist that hung in the air. Megan clutched Hannah's arm, her nails digging in even through the layers. "What do we do?" she hissed, her voice trembling but sharp with fear. Hannah didn't answer. She couldn't. There was no fighting this. Not now, not with their bodies broken and weak. The wolves had been watching them, tracking them for who knew how long, waiting for them to collapse. Claire's breath hitched, loud and ragged. "We don't have." A snarl ripped through her words. The biggest wolf lunged, its body a blur of gray and white hurtling toward them. Time slowed to a crawl. Hannah shoved Megan aside with all the strength she had left, the beast's jaws snapping inches from her face. She swung the stick wildly, her arms shaking, and it cracked against the wolf's flank. The animal barely flinched, its growl deepening as it steadied itself for another leap. The others moved in, circling slow and careful, their paws leaving faint prints in the snow. Lily screamed, a raw, piercing sound that echoed into the storm. Grace stumbled back, raising her hands as if she could push the wolves away with nothing but her will. Then, a sharp whistle sliced through the air. An arrow flew, fast and true, striking the lead wolf mid-leap. It collapsed with a heavy thud, its body crumpling into the snow, dark blood pooling beneath it. Another whistle. A second arrow. A third. The pack froze, heads snapping toward the trees. Shapes emerged from the shadows, figures wrapped in thick furs, their faces hidden, moving with quiet purpose. The wolves hesitated, then bolted, vanishing into the storm as fast as they'd come. The figures approached, their boots crunching the snow. Warriors. Lakota. Hannah's chest heaved, her lungs burning as she sucked in air. Every muscle in her body shook, exhaustion crashing over her like a wave. She tried to stand straight, to hold on to the last scraps of her pride, but her legs buckled beneath her. One warrior stepped forward, taller than the rest, his presence heavy even in the chaos. His dark eyes studied them, sharp and unreadable beneath the hood of his fur coat. He said something in Lakota, the words fast and unfamiliar, rolling off his tongue like a command. Megan, still clinging to Hannah, whispered, "What do we do?" Her voice was small, uncertain. Hannah stared at the man, taking in the bough still gripped in his hand, the fur lining his coat, the way he stood like he owned the storm itself. He'd saved them, him and his men. But now he could decide if they lived or died. He spoke again, slower this time, his English careful and measured. "You should not be here." Hannah's throat tightened, her voice barely a croak as she forced out one word, "Help." The wind howled around them, snow whipping through the air. Silence stretched long and tense, the storm holding its breath. The warrior's eyes didn't leave hers. Then, with a short, sharp nod, he gestured to his companions. Strong hands caught Hannah as her knees gave out completely, lifting her from the snow. Darkness swallowed her whole. Warmth came later, slow and hesitant, creeping in her frozen limbs like the first thaw after a brutal winter. She felt weightless, drifting, yet heavy too, her body anchored by a deep, bone-aching tiredness. The air smelled of smoke, sharp pine, of something else, herbal, bitter, soothing. Voices murmured around her, low and steady, speaking in a language she couldn't understand. Her eyelids fluttered open, sluggish and heavy. Dim light filtered through stretched hides, flickering as shadows moved beyond them. She was in a tent, alive, saved. Pain surged back as she tried to sit up, a dull throb spreading through her chest and legs. A hand pressed gently but firmly against her shoulder, pushing her back down. "You need to rest," a voice said, soft, steady, carrying quiet strength. Hannah turned her head, her vision blurry at first, then sharpening. A woman knelt beside her, maybe in her 30s, her dark hair woven into two long braids adorned with small, glinting beads. Her face was sharp, her eyes deep and kind. "Where?" Hannah rasped, her throat dry as dust, her voice cracking on the word. "You are safe," the woman said simply, offering her a small wooden bowl. "Drink this." Hannah hesitated, her hands trembling as she reached for it. Her fingers could barely close around the edges, weak and unsteady. She lifted it to her lips, the liquid inside thick and bitter, earthy in a way that stung her tongue. But as it slid down her throat, warmth ballooned in her chest, spreading slow and steady through her body. The woman nodded, a faint approval in her eyes. "You were close to death," she said. "Your friends too." Hannah's grip tightened on the bowl, her knuckles whitening. "The others, they're alive?" Her voice shook, fear and hope twisting together. "Yes," the woman said. "They live." Relief flooded through her, sharp and sudden, washing away some of the dread. But it didn't last. They were alive, yes, but for how long? What came next? Footsteps approached, heavy and deliberate. The tent flap shifted, letting in a gust of cold air. The tall warrior stepped inside, his broad shoulders filling the space, his fur coat dusted with fresh snow. His dark eyes swept over her, assessing, before settling on the woman beside her. "How is she?" he asked, his voice low and calm. "She will live," the woman replied, rising to her feet. He nodded once, then turned to Hannah. "You are in our winter camp," he said. "We brought you here when we found you in the storm." His tone was even, but there was something beneath it, something guarded, unreadable. Hannah met his gaze, forcing herself to sit up straighter despite the ache in her ribs. "You saved us," she said, her words slow, deliberate. He paused, his head tilting slightly. "We did." The silence that followed was heavy, loaded with questions he didn't ask aloud. "Should we have? What are you to us?" She could feel them hanging there, unspoken. "Thank you," she managed, her voice stronger now, though it still shook. He inclined his head, a small gesture, then turned and left, the flap rustling shut behind him. The days that followed merged into a hazy stretch of recovery under the Lakota's care. The women were housed in separate tents, looked after by Willow Sage, the healer whose name they'd come to know, and others skilled in mending bodies. Their wounds were coated with thick, pungent salves that burned at first but soon eased the pain, while warm broth and small bites of meat were given to rebuild the strength the cold had sapped. Megan was the first to resist her frailty, her stubborn spirit igniting as she paced her tent, stretching stiff legs and muttering curses about Jake, her helplessness, and the life she'd lost. Grace remained quiet, withdrawn, her hands resting still in her lap as she took food and care without comment. Her distant gaze lingered on memories of her son, last seen crying as her family tore him from her. Lily, restless as ever, filled the quiet with cautious jokes and tales from her saloon days, though her forced laughter never touched her eyes. Claire, hit hardest by the cold, healed slowest, her words rare as she poured her energy into simply breathing, staying alive. Willow Sage checked on her often, her touch gentle yet steady. Safety felt fragile, like thin ice over a river. On the third day, Willow Sage took them outside. The vast, blinding snow stretched endlessly, broken only by the camp. Smoke rose from tents into the gray sky. Children laughed, darting past in furs, while men worked, tending horses and supplies, their breaths visible. It was a thriving world, unlike their broken one. Kota stood at the camp center, talking quietly with two warriors. His eyes briefly met Hannah's as she emerged, then shifted away, his expression unreadable. "Come," Willow Sage said firmly. "You need to move to regain strength." The women followed, legs shaky on the snow, the cold biting but bearable with tents and fires nearby. They walked slowly, blood stirring again. Days stretched into a week and beyond. Megan, restless, began fetching water and wood, earning nods from some Lakota men, though others watched her warily. Grace sat by Willow's sage, silently learning to grind leaves and mix oils into sharp-smelling pouches, her hands finding purpose. Lily drifted to the edges of the camp, drawn to the horses tethered there. Their breath steamed in the air, their dark eyes watching her as she approached. An older man, his face lined with years, showed her how to braid their manes, how to move slow and calm so they wouldn't startle. For once, she listened without a quip, her hands steady as she worked. Claire struggled the most, her body still weak, her breath shallow. She stayed inside most days, wrapped in furs, but Willow Sage made her walk a little each morning. 10 steps, then 20, then more. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her fighting. Hannah watched it all, her eyes sharp, taking in every detail. She saw the way some of the Lakota accepted them, offering small nods or a shared piece of bread. She saw the others who kept their distance, their gazes cold and wary, as if the women were a storm waiting to break. She saw Coda, always nearby, but never too close, his presence a quiet constant. She saw Megan clench her fists when she thought no one was looking, her anger simmering just below the surface. She saw Lily laugh too loud, her hands twitching when she thought no one noticed. She saw Grace stare into the fire at night, her face blank, but her eyes alive with something unspoken, grief, maybe, or resolve. One evening, as the sky burned red with the setting sun, Coda approached her. She was stacking firewood, her hands raw from the work. "You learn fast," he said, his voice low, nodding at the pile. She wiped her palms on her skirts, the rough fabric scratching her skin. "We don't have the luxury of not learning," she replied, meeting his gaze. He studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching hers. "You do not belong here," he said finally. Her chest tightened, a pang of truth she couldn't deny. "I know," she said softly. "You should have died out there." His words were blunt, matter of fact. She exhaled, slow and shaky. "I know that too." He tilted his head, just slightly, as if weighing her answer. "What do you intend to do?" It was the question she'd been asking herself since she'd woken up in that tent, since the warmth had pulled her back from the edge. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I won't let the people who did this to us think we just disappeared." Something flickered in his eyes, respect, maybe a warning. "That will bring trouble," he said. She lifted her chin, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Trouble already found us." For the first time, the corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile. He nodded once, then turned and walked away, his boots leaving faint prints in the snow. That night, as the fire crackled low and the others drifted into restless sleep, Hannah lay awake, staring up at the sky through a small gap in the tent. The stars burned bright, sharp points of light against the black. She didn't know what came next, but for the first time since they'd been cast out, she felt something shift inside her. Not just fear, not just survival, readiness. The fire's embers glowed faintly against the cold night, casting long shadows across the women's faces as they sat in a tight circle. The silence was heavy, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The warmth of the Lakota camp had given them strength, yes, but it had also given them time. Time to remember, time to feel the weight of what had been done to them. And remembering was a dangerous thing. Hannah turned a knife over in her hands, its blade catching the firelight, sharp and gleaming. Coda had given it to her earlier that evening, pressing it into her palm without a word. His eyes had been steady, his meaning clear. This wasn't a gift for show. It was a tool, a weapon. There'd come a time to use it, and that time was creeping closer. Megan broke the silence first, her voice cutting through the quiet like a whip. "We can't stay here forever." Her hands rested on her knees, clenched tight, her knuckles white. Lily let out a low chuckle, but there was no warmth in it, just a bitter edge. "No," she said, her green eyes flicking to the fire. I reckon not. But going back, she trailed off, her breath sharp as she exhaled. They left us for dead. They won't be happy to see us walking back in. They'll wish we were ghosts when we're through with them, Megan snapped, her voice hard, her jaw tight. She leaned forward, the firelight painting her face in sharp angles. Grace rubbed at her wrist absently, her fingers tracing old scars, her expression unreadable. "We need to think this through," she said softly, her words slow and deliberate. "We aren't just walking into town to prove we're alive. If we go back, it has to mean something." Hannah nodded, her grip tightening around the knife's handle until her fingers ached. "It means justice," she said, her voice low but firm. Claire, still pale, still frail, spoke for the first time that night, her words barely above a whisper. "Justice." She let out a breath, bitter and tired, her eyes fixed on the flames. "Or revenge?" The question settled over them like a heavy blanket, pressing down, making the air feel thick. Hannah knew what Claire meant, knew the line between the two was blurry, easy to cross. But there was no room for doubt now, not after everything. "Justice," she repeated, as much for herself as for them, forcing the word to carry weight. "We don't go back just to settle scores. We go back to make sure this doesn't happen again, to show them they don't get to decide when we stop breathing." Megan let out a long breath, steadying herself, her shoulders squaring. "Then we need a plan," she said, her tone shifting from anger to determination. "A real one." The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks into the air, and the women fell silent again, each turning the idea over in their minds. What would it take? How would they face the people who'd tried to erase them? The next morning, Coda stood waiting as they emerged from their tent, his arms crossed over his chest, his stance solid as stone. His face was unreadable, as always, but there was a tension in the way he held himself. "You're leaving," he said, not a question, but a statement. Hannah met his gaze, unflinching. "We are." He studied them, his dark eyes moving from one woman to the next. Megan's clenched fists, Lily's restless energy, Grace's quiet resolve, Claire's fragile strength. "Finally," he sighed, a sound that carried both resignation and something else. "You're not ready," he said. Megan's hands twitched at her sides, her voice sharp. "We don't have a choice." Coda nodded slowly, as if he'd known she'd say that, as if he'd seen this coming from the moment they'd woken in his camp. "Then you will not go alone," he said. Hannah blinked, caught off guard. "You're helping us?" Her voice rose slightly, disbelief creeping in. His lips quirked, the faintest hint of a smile. "You are stubborn," he said. "But you're also right. If you disappear into the world without a trace, the people who did this to you will never answer for it." He turned to his warriors, gathered nearby, and gave a single nod. "We ride at first light." The journey back was slow, deliberate, the land stretching wide and quiet before them. The snow crunched under the horses' hooves, the cold air biting at their faces, their hands. Every mile they covered pulled them closer to the past they'd barely escaped, closer to the people who'd tried to bury them in it. Megan rode ahead, her shoulders rigid, her hands tight on the reins. Hannah could feel the fury rolling off her, thick and heavy, aimed at Jake, the man who'd laughed as he'd thrown her out. Lily rode beside her, quieter than usual, her lips pressed into a thin line. Her green eyes darted to the horizon, then back to the group, restless and wary. Grace stayed at the back, her gaze fixed on the distance, her thoughts locked on her son. Somewhere out there, alive, growing up in hands that weren't hers. Claire rode in the middle, her grip loose on the reins, her body still weak, but her eyes sharp with something new, something unbreakable. Hannah rode beside Coda, the silence between them thick but not uncomfortable. "You do not have to do this," she said finally, her voice low, her breath puffing out in the cold. He glanced at her, his expression steady. "I do," he replied, simple and final. She didn't argue. He gave a small nod, and they rode on, the town drawing closer with every step. By dusk, it came into view, wooden buildings huddled together, lanterns flickering in the growing dark. It looked the same as when they'd been cast out, as if time had stood still while they'd fought to survive. Hannah's chest tightened, a mix of dread and fire twisting inside her. They stopped at the edge of town, the Lakota warriors hanging back in the shadows, their presence a silent promise. "We do this together," Hannah said, her voice steady despite the pounding in her heart. Megan was the first to move, dismounting and striding forward, her boots striking hard against the frozen ground. She walked with purpose, her head high, cutting through the center of town like a blade. People turned to stare, their murmurs rising like a rustling wind. "It's them," someone whispered. "They were supposed to be dead." Another hissed, fear threading through the words. Jake Sullivan stepped out of the saloon, a mug of ale in his hand, his broad frame filling the doorway. His face went slack when he saw Megan, his eyes widening for a split second before he forced a scowl. "What the hell is this?" he growled, his voice rough but unsteady. Megan stopped a few feet from him, standing tall, her hands balled into fists. "It's me, Jake," she said, her tone cold and even. "Back from the dead." He scoffed, but there was unease in his eyes, a flicker of doubt he couldn't hide. "You ain't supposed to be here," he said, his grip tightening on the mug. "Neither is my land," she shot back, stepping closer. "But you've been keeping it warm for me, haven't you?" His jaw clenched, his knuckles widening. "You don't get to just come back," he spat. She took another step, her voice low and dangerous. "I was never gone." Lily moved next, her boots loud on the wooden planks as she strode toward the saloon keeper. He stood near Jake, his face darkening as she approached. "Got anything to say to me?" she asked, her tone sharp, her green eyes glinting with defiance. He sneered, his lip curling. "You don't belong here." She smiled, cold and bitter. "I never did I?" Grace's eyes swept the street, searching, her breath shallow. Then she saw them, a woman on the steps of the church, a small boy at her side. Her son, Noah, she whispered, the name catching in her throat. She walked forward, slow and deliberate, her hands trembling but her steps sure. The woman, her sister-in-law, went rigid, her face paling. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, clutching the boy's shoulder. Grace didn't stop. "Give me my son," she said, her voice unshakable. The tension in the air thickened, pressing down on the crowd that had gathered. Hannah stepped forward, her voice ringing out across the street, clear and strong. "You all thought you could erase us," she said, her gaze sweeping over them, meeting eyes she'd once known, eyes that had smiled at her before turning away. "You thought you could cast us aside and move on. But you were wrong." A ripple of unease moved through the people, their whispers growing louder, more nervous. A voice called out from the sheriff's office, sharp and commanding. "You're causing a disturbance," the sheriff said, stepping onto the porch, one hand resting on the gun at his hip. He studied them for a long moment, his weathered face tightening, then shook his head. "You should leave." Claire, pale and swaying but resolute, lifted her chin. "No," she said, her voice small but firm. Hannah's hands curled into fists, her nails digging into her palms. "You let this happen," she said, her eyes locked on the sheriff. "You stood by while women were thrown out to die." His expression darkened, his hand twitching toward his gun. "That's the way things are," he said, his tone flat. "No," Hannah said, stepping closer, her voice rising. "That's the way you let them be." A shot rang out, shattering the quiet. The world exploded into chaos. Megan dove to the side, her body moving faster than her mind could catch up. Lily yanked a knife from her boot, her eyes wild, her breath fast. Koda and his warriors shifted in the shadows, quick and silent, their hands on their weapons. Jake Sullivan hit the ground, clutching his leg, blood seeping through his fingers. His pistol lay a few feet away, knocked from his grip. Hannah stood over him, her gun still smoking, her chest heaving. Silence fell, heavy and sudden. The town held its breath, every eye on them. Grace took another step toward Noah, her voice soft but piercing. "Noah," she said again. The boy turned, confused, his small hand reaching for hers. It closed around her fingers, tentative but real. It was enough. The woman on the steps froze, her mouth opening but no words coming out. Hannah inhaled deeply, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. They'd won. Not with blood, not with destruction, but by being seen, by refusing to vanish. The sheriff hesitated, his hand still on his gun, then stepped back, shaking his head. No one moved to stop them. No one dared. Megan stared down at Jake, her face unreadable. He glared up at her, his breath ragged. "You should have killed me," he spat, his voice breaking, his hand twitching toward his fallen gun. She pressed her boot against his wrist, grinding it into the dirt until he hissed in pain. "No," she said quietly, her tone steady. "That's the difference between you and me. I don't throw away life like it's nothing." The woman opened her mouth to argue, but the sheriff's tired voice cut through. She's right. None of it was ever legal. His confession came too late to undo the pain, but it cracked the silence. Grace held Noah tighter. Claire swayed but steadied herself. "What happens now?" The sheriff looked at the town. "That's up to all of you." No one stepped forward. Change had come, whether they wanted it or not. Hannah holstered her gun. "Let's go." They turned to their horses. Megan hesitated, then walked away. At the town's edge, Lakota warriors waited, a silent reminder they were never alone. Coda met Hannah's gaze. Satisfied, she hesitated. "For now," he smiled. "Justice never lasts long." "No," she said, "but long enough." They rode out. Snow stretched wide, but it didn't feel so merciless now. The sun broke through, lighting the path they'd carved with pain and will. Megan's voice was steady. "What now?" Hannah glanced at the others. "We live." They rode on, toward the future they had claimed.